So we have a super important article here regarding Syria and the gas attacks or alleged gas attacks in Douma. And this is from the Independent over in the UK. And this is from Robert Fisk. And the headline is "The Search for Truth in the Rubble of Douma and One Doctor's Doubts Over the Chemical Attack." Exclusive. Robert Fisk visits the Syria clinic at the center of a global crisis. This is the story of a town called Douma, a ravaged, stinking place of smashed apartment blocks and of an underground clinic whose images of suffering allowed 3 of the Western world's most powerful nations to bomb Syria last week. There's even a friendly doctor in a green coat who, when I tracked him down in the very same clinic, cheerfully tells me that the gas videotape which horrified the world, despite all the doubters, is perfectly genuine. War stories, however, have a habit of growing darker. For the same 58-year-old senior Syrian doctor then adds something profoundly uncomfortable. The patients, he said, were overcome not by gas, but by oxygen starvation in the rubbish-filled tunnels and basements in which they lived, on a night of windy and heavy shelling that stirred up a dust storm. So let's stop there just for a second. The doctor he found in the clinic, where all these videos are from, says the videos are real. But what he also says is what you're seeing in the video is people suffering from oxygen starvation, from living in rubbish-filled tunnels and basements on the night of heavy wind and shelling that stirred up a dust storm. All right, let's keep reading. Not a gas attack, according to the doctor in that clinic, but people suffering from oxygen starvation. The article continues. As Dr. Asim Rahibiani announces this extraordinary conclusion, it is worth observing that he is, by his own admission, not an eyewitness himself. And, as he speaks good English, he refers twice to the jihadi gunmen of Jaish al-Islam, the Army of Islam, in Douma as terrorists, the regime's word for their enemies, and a term used by many people across Syria. Am I hearing this right? Which versions of events are we to believe? By bad luck, too, the doctors who were on duty that night, on 7 of April, were all in Damascus giving evidence to a chemical weapons inquiry, which will be attempting to provide a definitive answer to that question in the coming weeks. France, meanwhile, has said it has proof, quote, proof, chemical weapons were used, and U.S. media has quoted sources saying urine and blood tests showed this too. The World Health Organization has said its partners on the ground treated 500 patients, quote, exhibiting signs and symptoms consistent with exposure to toxic chemicals, end quote. At the same time, inspectors from the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, OPCW, are currently blocked from coming here to the site of the alleged gas attack themselves, ostensibly because they lack the correct UN permits. So somehow, they're allowing the journalists to go there to report on this gas attack and subsequent bombings, illegal bombings by the US, France, and the United Kingdom. But the goddamn independent investigators, Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, who have been sent there to investigate, still aren't allowed because they don't, quote, have the proper permit. If that doesn't sound fishy to you, I don't know what does. Let's continue reading. Before we go any further, readers should be aware that this is not the only story in Duma. There are many people I talked to amid the ruins of the town who said they had believed, quote, never believed in, quote, gas stories, which were usually put about, they claimed, by the armed Islamic groups. These particular jihadists survived under a blizzard of shellfire by living in other people's homes and in vast wide tunnels with underground roads carved through the living rock by prisoners with pickaxes on 3 levels beneath the town. I walked through 3 of them yesterday, vast corridors of living rock which still contained Russian, yes, Russian rockets and burned out cars. So the story of Doma is thus not just a story of gas, or no gas, as the case may be. It's about thousands of people who did not opt for evacuation from Duma on buses that left last week, alongside the gunmen with whom they had to live like troglodytes for months in order to survive. I walked across this town quite freely yesterday, without soldier, policeman, or minder to haunt my footsteps. Just 2 Syrian friends, a camera, and a notebook. I had to sometimes clamber across 20-foot-high ramparts up and down almost sheer walls of earth. Happy to see foreigners amongst them, happier still that the siege is finally over. They are mostly smiling, those whose faces you can see, of course, because of the surprising number of Doma's women wear full-length black hijabs. I first drove into Doma as part of an escorted convoy of journalists. But once a boring general had announced outside a wrecked council house, quote, I have no information, end quote, that most helpful rubbish dump of Arab officialdom, I just walked away. Several other reporters, mostly Syrian, did the same. Even a group of Russian journalists, all in military attire, drifted off. It was a short walk to Dr. Rahiabani from the door of his subterranean clinic. Point 200, it is called, in the weird geology of this partly underground city. It is a corridor leading downhill where he showed me his lowly hospital and the few beds where a small girl was crying as nurses treated a cut above her eye. I was with my family in the basement of my home, 300 meters from here on the night, but all the doctors know what happened. There was a lot of shelling by government forces and the aircraft were always over Doma at night. But on this night, there was wind and huge dust clouds began to come into the basements and cellars where people lived. People began to arrive here suffering from hypoxia, oxygen loss. Then someone at the door, a, quote, white helmet, shouted, gas. And a panic began. People started throwing water over each other. Yes, the video was filmed here. It was genuine. But what you can see are people suffering from hypoxia, not gas poisoning. All right, so let me read that again, because this is the doctor talking about what happened that night. This is all him speaking. Quote, I was with my family in the basement of my home 300 meters from here on the night, but all the doctors know what happened. There was a lot of shelling by government forces and aircraft were always over Doma at night. But on this night, there was wind and huge dust clouds began to come into the basements and cellars where people lived. People began to arrive here suffering from hypoxia, oxygen loss. Then someone at the door, a white helmet, shouted gas, and a panic began. People started throwing water over each other. Yes, the video was filmed here. It is genuine, but what you see are people suffering from hypoxia, not gas poisoning, end quote. This is what that doctor is saying. Oddly, after chatting to more than 20 people, I couldn't find one who showed the slightest interest in Doma's role in bringing about the Western airstrikes. 2 actually told me they didn't know about the connection. But it was a strange world I walked into. 2 men, Hussam and Nazir Abu Aish, said they were unaware how many people had been killed in Doma, although the latter admitted he had a cousin executed by Jaish al-Islam, the Army of Islam, for allegedly being, quote, too close to the regime, end quote. They shrugged when I asked about the 43 people said to have died in the infamous Doma attack. So let's just stop right there for a second. Almost all the people he talked to there don't really know or care about the supposed gas attack. And they consistently keep calling the so-called moderates, these rebels who were in charge of the city up until just the other day, terrorists. Jaish el-Islam, the army of Islam. Does that sound like a moderate rebel to you? Or does that sound like a jihadi group who is ready to build a nation under Sharia law? Because that's what they are. But let's keep reading. The White Helmets, the medical first responders already legendary in the West, but with some interesting corners to their own story, played a familiar role during the battles. We can get into the White Helmets in another video, but the allegations against the White Helmets are basically that they're a Western-funded jihadi propagandist group that rescues jihadi groups from Western airstrikes and then uses the footage as propaganda tools, which then the West prints all over their newspapers and their media sources as an excuse to keep these horrible regime change wars going under the guise of humanitarianism. So the White Helmets are more than likely just a tool of Western imperialism, but let's keep reading. They are partly funded by the Foreign Office, and most of the local offices were staffed by Duma men. I found their wrecked offices not far from Dr. Rahiabani's clinic. A gas mask had been left outside a food container with one piece pierced, and a pile of dirty military camouflage uniforms lay inside one room. Planted? I asked myself. I doubt it. This place was heaped with capsules, broken medical equipment and files, bedding and mattresses. Of course we must hear their side of the story, but it will not help in here. A woman told us that every member of the White Helmets in Duma abandoned their main headquarters and chose to take the government-organized and Russian-protected buses to the rebel province of Idlib with the armed groups when the final truce was agreed. So strangely, these White Helmets didn't want to be around when any of these Western forces showed up. They went and hid with the Army of Islam. Who knew? They evacuated with the Army of Islam. Who knew? Let's keep reading. There were food stalls open and a patrol of Russian military policemen, a now optional extra for every Syrian ceasefire, and no one had even bothered to storm into the forbidding Islamist prison near Martyrs Square, where victims were supposedly beheaded in the basements. The town's complement of Syrian Interior Ministry civilian police, who eerily wear military clothes, are watched over by the Russians, who may or may not be watched by the civilians. Again, my earnest questions about gas were met with what seemed genuine perplexity. How could it be that Duma refugees who had reached camps in Turkey were already describing gas attack which no one in Duma today seemed to recall? That's a fucking pretty profound question. How are people being questioned in Turkey so familiar with this gas attack, yet the people who are still in Duma have no idea what you're talking about? Let's keep reading. It did occur to me, once I was walking for more than a mile through these wretched prisoner-groin tunnels, that the citizens of Duma lived so isolated from each other for so long that, quote, news, in our sense of the word, simply had no meaning to them. Syria doesn't cut it as Jeffersonian democracy, as I cynically like to tell my Arab colleagues. It is indeed a ruthless dictatorship. But that couldn't cow these people, happy to see foreigners among them, from reacting with a few words of truth. So what are they telling me? What were they telling me? They talked about the Islamists under whom they had lived. They talked about how the armed groups have stolen civilian homes to avoid the Syrian government and Russian bombing. The Jaish al-Islam had burned their offices before they left, but the massive buildings inside the security zones they created had almost all been sandwiched to the ground by airstrikes. A Syrian colonel I came across behind one of these buildings asked if I wanted to see how deep the tunnels were. I stopped after well over a mile when he cryptically observed, quote, "This tunnel might reach as far as Britain," end quote. Ah, yes, Miss May, I remembered, whose airstrikes had been so intimately connected to this place of tunnels and dust and gas. So just some closing thoughts here. This is insane. So we have one journalist, just one journalist on the ground trying to do their job in Syria is already painting a very different picture than what we have been shown in mainstream media. We illegally bombed Syria 1 year ago, and we just illegally bombed Syria yet again because they supposedly gas attacked their own citizens, which we have no proof of. And now, according to Russian officials, as well as Fisk here, this gas attack might not even have taken place. The videos we're seeing may be of people suffering from hypoxia, from inhaling dust and dirt and living in basements while bombs and airstrikes are going off. It might not even have been a gas attack. It basically was a shitstorm, a sandstorm. And our imperialist government used that as an excuse to bomb more innocent people. And there's a lot more detail and a lot more weeds that we can get into, but that'll be for other videos. For this video, I just wanted to keep it to Fisk's article here in The Independent. Please go to The Independent and read this article. Please share this article, and please share this video, because the truth matters. And as much as the mainstream media wants to serve our corporate state and military-industrial complex, the independent media wants to tell the truth and wants to expose the lies of this belligerent empire. So please support people who are doing that, and please support the few journalists in mainstream outlets that are willing to speak truth to power. And please support any independent journalists that you know and love.